some 30 years ago in the UK, there were a spread of corporate failures, like BCCI and the Bishopsgate Investment Management Limited because of the pension. And then a governance report focused on the financial aspects of corporate governance was issued by the Cadbury. And then about 3 years later, by '95, there was another corporate governance, again, issued specifically on key executives of the utilities that were paid significant amount of money. So they needed to set compensations, and it was a Greenberry report. About 1999, then the OECD corporate governance principles were issued. And in 1998, we had Hampel, which issued also the first combined code of corporate governance for the UK. And that has set the stage for the governance framework that we know of now. It went on to have sections on audit committees, nomination committees, compensation committees, and the various aspects of corporate governance. Now, with that, I'm going to introduce you to our next presenter, Anne Molyneux, joining us online from Australia, I believe. That's where she is at right now. Anne is a director and a lead consultant with the advisory firm CS International, a chartered accountant, fellow, a master of management, currently a vice chair of the International Corporate Governance Network, ICGN. Anne has been a member of the IFRS Advisory Council, the IIRC Council, the IASB, several accolades. You will learn a lot about the corporate governance aspect of governance mainstreaming that we need to do. So with that, I would like to invite Anne. Anne, are you there?
I'll just go ahead with my presentation. I'd like to thank the ABE, the FSD, and the IFC for the invitation to join you today. It's been most heartening to hear of all the initiatives that is going on in Africa, but also particularly in Ethiopia. I have been charged by the IFC to investigate the state of ESG in Ethiopia and to try to provide for you one national code for ESG for Ethiopia and for application elsewhere. So I'd like to just talk in the next slide exactly what kind of questions I always get when I speak to a group like yourselves. In your group, you'll find some people who are really experts in ESG, such as Vimal, our previous speaker, and others that are confident but need to understand a little bit more. Some have knowledge but need a little bit of help with ESG, and some have little or no prior knowledge. That is a normal circumstance for any country, any group, trying to discuss and consider the issues of sustainability and ESG. Now, throughout this session with the next slide, I'm going to have a little look at exploring what is sustainability and the link with ESG, to understand the value of it in the markets, and to explore the role of regulators, boards, and companies, and just to identify one particular situation in Africa to show you it is possible to organize for sustainability. But I'm also cognizant that some of my slides have been dealt with by particularly Vimal previously, and so I will move quickly through one or two. The next slide looks at why we need to consider ESG activities and reporting. You know, the world at large does need to know that Africa and Ethiopia is addressing ESG issues. Many investors are not allowed now to invest if there is not sufficient E, S, and G activity either in the company or in the country. And so the world at large is looking very closely at what regulatory requirements are in a particular country or in a particular industry, and also stakeholders, people who work for companies, people in the supply chains of companies, people who are their employees, their communities in which the companies operate, all have expectations that there will be sustainability within the business. So going to the next slide, the business case for sustainability and sustainability activity and reporting is unrelenting. There is the investor interest. Investors will only now, and I can quote you, for example, BlackRock, one of the biggest investors in the world, actually looks at, they look at they send letters to their clients and saying, we're on the cusp of a tectonic shift in capital markets to stakeholder capitalism. Before it was shareholder capitalism. But if you don't listen to your stakeholders and make sure that your company is sustainable for the communities in which they operate, for the employees with whom they operate, for the supply chain in which they operate, then we won't be investing. So that's, and BlackRock is not alone. Many others, many other major investors in the world have said, well, in 10 years, take for example, Fidelity, a global pension fund investor. It says it's going to reduce its investment in anything with a carbon footprint by 50% within 10 years. So you must listen to the demand of investors. Standard & Poor's have said companies in 2011, only 20% of companies, of the 500 Standard & Poor's companies, provided sustainable information. By 2019, that had risen to 90%. So in fact, you must listen to the investors, but not only just, it's not just business case for sustainability is not just driven by investors. Companies benefit. It improves consideration of the environment in which businesses operate, of the social consequences of their operations. It improves their decision making. It also builds stock exchange and business reputation, countrywide business reputation. So it helps focus companies on sustainability strategies, not strategies for the short term to make a quick buck, but rather that they will remain in business for a long term because they are managing their sustainability risks and opportunities. So going to the next slide, I'm going to just give you the example on COVID. Now remember with COVID, from Australia, we were completely shut down. And what you found is businesses were shut down. They couldn't earn money. They couldn't produce goods. When investigation took place by Refinitiv in 2020, it showed that companies that had the highest and best ESG scores lost less profitability, lost less money. And those with the lowest ESG scores lost more. So there is a good financial reason too to pay attention to sustainability. So what is sustainability and how does it link with governance? Good governance is about how companies are led, the people who lead the companies, the things that they do, the structure that they have for their governance, who's on the board, what kind of skills they have. So when we want to have a company that's looking forward, looking to being sustainable for the long term, you've got to look at every element of your governance. You've got to, boards will have to develop a strategy of initiatives to be sure they are sustainable, that they are managing their E, environmental issues, their S, their social issues, and their governance. But also that they are considering their stakeholders. No company can operate without stakeholders. Stakeholders provide resources, employees, supply chains. So the change in governance means you now, as a board of directors of a company, must also consider your stakeholders. What are their needs? What are their interests in the company? And how do those align with the company long-term strategies? Are the stakeholder interests included in the long-term strategy for the company. But if you look, if you look at a list of stakeholders in a company, it could be employees, it could be customers, it could be community. There's a lot of interested parties. Can you, as a board of directors, consider all their needs and interests and run the company? My advice is no. You really do need to consider which are your key stakeholders, which are the material stakeholders, and what are the material interests, needs of those stakeholders, and make sure you address those issues. In Australia, we've had several embarrassments regarding sustainability, particularly from the mining industry, and in particular with our Indigenous population, whereby mining companies have gone in and destroyed 40,000-year-old artworks important to the Indigenous Aboriginal Australian. And then they find, oh, well, the mine wasn't really worth as much as the fines that they have to pay because they destroyed those artworks. You really do need to know who are your stakeholders, what are their interests, are their interests changing? So you'll need to undertake a materiality assessment of your stakeholders and their interests to be sure you, as a board of directors of a company, are in fact considering those issues in your decision making and in your strategy. As a board of directors too, if you're governing sustainability, you've got to know what are the key strategies that are going to make you sustainable. What are the key strategies, targets, key performance indicators? Measure your sustainability achievement and report on this progress so that the world at large can recognise you as a very well-governed company looking to being sustainable for the long term. Now, the next slide, if we go to it, you'll see here all the lists of environmental, social and governance issues that you need to consider. I'm not going to go through these again because Vimal did a very, very good job on discussing these. And Vimal did a very good job. But just notice, in the environmental issues, one that is key at the moment is climate change. Everybody has to deal some way or other with climate change and the impact of climate change, with energy, with water scarcity. But coming up are other ones like biodiversity, like waste, circulating your waste and so on. So these are all the issues you as a board are going to have to consider when you're developing and providing your strategy, your long-term strategy for the company. The next slide really just talks about all the detailed factors. I'm not going into this. Greenhouse gas emissions, board diversity, we've seen all of that. But what I would like to focus on is a major change that is occurring now. I mean, right now. The next slide talks about the review of the OECD principles of corporate governance, which now include principles for E, S, and G. Now, over the past 2 years, I sit working for business, advising the OECD on the changes to their principles. Their principles were revised over the past 18 months and were issued in June 2023. So this is a very new issue. This is a global regulator that regulates or provides advice to all the developed markets of the world. So what does that have to do with Africa? Well, in actual fact, any business that is doing business in Africa that is from the developed world should apply these principles. And I'm going to go to the next slide just to discuss some of the major changes, because it does include sustainability and building company long-term resilience. The OECD has said it wants all companies to promote sustainability-related disclosure so that investors can understand what are the standards a company is using, what are the metrics a company is using to measure how they're doing on sustainability, and phasing in of, Hikmet mentioned this, assurance on sustainability information given to investors. In this whole new chapter, it's just on sustainability. The OECD mentions that all information must be on actual activities, not greenwashing or blue washing, on actual sustainable activities, and the information should be consistent and comparable across company to company, across country to country, which is why Ethiopia is looking at an ESG code, a pan-national ESG code. But also, the sustainability chapter requires information that can be reasonably assumed to influence an investor's assessment of a company's value. So you can see sustainability is being built right into everything a company needs to tell the public at large if it wishes to attract investment. Companies should have, and boards of directors should develop strategies for sustainability with reliable metrics to measure how they're going and report on those measures. But in actual fact, this is not an easy thing to do. And the last point there, 4A5, talks about the need to phase in requirements. Don't introduce everything all at once because business cannot necessarily manage, but take it step by step. The new next slide shows the new some additional information on sustainability and resilience. Board responsibilities, sustainability risks should be managed, overseen, reported to the board, and the board should discuss those risks. And in actual fact, when you look at these key findings, you will find the HICMET will refer to the overarching accounting body, which is IFAC. IFAC, the International Federation of Accountants, the global body for accountants worldwide, in 2021 did a study of 1,400 target companies in 22 countries, and 91% of companies reviewed report sustainability information. 51% of companies that report sustainability information provide some level of assurance on it. So what is the message that Ethiopia should be getting here? You will have to report on your ESG strategies, targets, metrics, and activities, and you need to treat all of that information which you're going to make public like financial information. Be sure that it is correct, the data is correct, and you later on may be required to provide assurance over it. If you look at the next slide, which is a map of the world, you will see where ESG and sustainability reporting has really got ahead of steam. All the green countries and the darker green countries show a considerable amount of assurance over ESG information, but all the green countries actually have considerable reporting on ESG and sustainability activities. And you can see there on the African map, there is a little bit of a time lag. But that's why I'm so heartened to hear of this initiative today and all the initiatives that Ethiopia is taking. So when you go to the next slide, when you want to apply ESG reporting, there's a plethora, a large number of standards out there. There's the Global Reporting Initiative standards, standards for the United States from the SASB, the Sustainable Development Goals from the UN, there's many standards, but the one that we really probably need to focus on will be the global standards coming from the IFRS. Now, I have spent, if we go to the next slide, I have spent a lot of my lifetime dealing with international standards globally, and countries that adopt IFRS financial standards are also adopting IFRS sustainability standards. And Vimal mentioned the two standards, I don't think it was female, but the introducer mentioned IFRS S1 and S2. These have been approved in June 2023. I mean, right now. And so the first standard sets out the general reporting requirements that an entity should disclose about the sustainability risks and opportunities of a company so that investors can assess the governance, the strategy, the risk management, and so on. And of course, because climate is such a focus, then S2 is about climate-related disclosures. Now, why do I mention disclosure, disclosure, disclosure? You can't have a disclosure unless you have an activity. And disclosure of sustainability activities is most important. First the activity, then the disclosure. So global standards are coming, but also regional. Going to the next slide, you'll see the European Union has developed many standards for all European countries on corporate sustainability actions and reporting. Any large company in Africa who reports to or has a parent in the EU or actually provides goods into the EU over about $150 million, euros, then you will be affected by these regulations. They have 13 standards out there requiring sustainability information. But the scope of the directive, the laws in the EU are quite considerable and affect European and non-European companies listed and operating in the EU. But I want to draw your attention to this last set of letters on my slide. CSRDDD. What is that? Corporate Sustainability Reporting Due Diligence Directive, which was issued in 2022. Now that says any European country has to report and do due diligence on its sustainability of its supply chain, upstream and downstream. So if in fact you are a Kenyan farmer, for example, the flower farms in Kenya have been proactive in adopting eco-friendly technologies. Why? Because the people who are buying those flowers in the Netherlands have to report the supply chain, greenhouse gas emissions and so on. So the flower farms in Kenya have been using hydroponics, water management practices, integrated pest management, and so on, rainwater harvesting, solar power, and changing even the freight of flowers. It used to always go by plane. Now they're trying and transitioning to, if they can, the transport by sea. There's less greenhouse gas emissions. So that is how Africa and Ethiopia is going to be affected if you do, not just by investors, but also if you do any major business in the EU. So who else has standards that they're coming forward with? Well, our good friends, the IFC, has a position. It says it wants the governance of companies to consider sustainability in its decisions. Board directors need to be trained in E and S, risk issues. Strategy and risk management should be integrating environmental and social issues into its activities. At the very least, IFC expects, if they're going to support your company in Ethiopia, they expect one director with E and S risk experience. And if you're a big company, they may say you need 2 directors with E and S risk experience. Do you have enough directors in Ethiopia with that experience? Maybe a lot of training is required. They want to see sustainability as a recurring board agenda item and so on. So in fact, in summary, the role of companies, going to that slide, the role of companies, we need to educate the board and senior executives to more fully integrate ESG, sustainability activities, and report on those. But it's not just companies. when you look at this slide, I told you there are many potential audiences for the ESG disclosures that companies have to make. Investors, customers, suppliers, employees, regulators, NGOs, media, competitors, academia, and so on. Companies and company management will have to consider all these potential audiences for their ESG activities and disclosures. Next slide shows exactly what I've been really heartened about in Ethiopia. The regulators, I see the National Bank of Ethiopia, RBA, all standing at ECMA, all standing up and saying, we have a role to lead on sustainability activity in Ethiopia. And they have recognized the importance of their role in country for sustainable development, and are encouraging meaningful, accurate, timely, comprehensive disclosures about what companies are doing for sustainability. They are encouraging and keeping in view, in their view, the global standards and developments that are occurring, and they are occurring very, very fast. So if you're a company, you'll have to keep your own eye out to see what the regulators are doing and changing. They will need, and just as Ethiopia is doing, introduce one clear ESG code standard for all companies, all entities in Ethiopia. It may be mandatory for some and voluntary for others. But that's what I mean about phasing in the total movement towards ESG activity and reporting. Hikmet mentioned monitoring and overseeing adherence to the code that we will develop and promoting the reforms. Today is one of those such promotions. Going to the next slide, you'll see also stock exchanges have a role. I'm not going to go into this in great depth, but they do have a role because they sit uniquely at an intersection between investors, companies, and regulators, and so can promote responsible investment and sustainable development. And going to the next slide, you will see stock exchanges have been increasing written guidance. The top line on this graph shows that 23 exchanges have provided written guidance on ESG activities and disclosures. And some, the second lower line, shows that they have made those disclosures mandatory. So overall, globally, everybody is moving to regulation to move capital to sustainable development. So moving to the next slide, what should we have? And the next slide again shows that we will need tools to support sustainability activities and reporting, a national action plan, a company action plan, legislation and regulation to support that action plan, a code coherent and aligned with other legislations related to E, S, and G, a code, one for all in a country. Extra guidance on particular issues may be required. Tools, checklists, templates, training, examples of successful companies doing this. You have a lot ahead of you, but all I can say is I congratulate you on taking these first initiative steps. Going to the next slide, the global ESG regulatory framework is toughening up. And all I will say is you will have more regulation coming. Some will be mandatory, some might be voluntary. But all I can say is it's coming, and it's coming all the way around the world. So in summary, to my last slide, countries and regulators can choose your strategy and level of sustainability intervention, but some action and obvious action is advised. The approach has to address current national legislation and regulation. In other words, it has to start where you are currently and move forward from then. A national ESG code is absolutely essential, and companies and the nation should prioritise the global trends for information. that affect your industries. For example, if you're into agribusiness or manufacturing, then your code will need to have focus on those particular issues. Any code should consider local needs, market size, market participants, small and medium-sized enterprises. If you have a lot of those, they may need extra guidance and help. So going to my last point, congratulations, but you must believe increased regulation is coming fast, and it will change fundamentally the governance of companies. Now, I'm happy to answer questions if you wish, or to take emails on advisement. Thank you so much for listening.